everybody. This experiment was conducted in a 3-meter width by 5-meter length by 2-meter high flight cage. And the conditions were ideal for the bees. The conditions were around 27 to 30 degrees Celsius. And they used sucrose solution, which serves as the reward, and water as a non-reward. And so basically we can see here on this plant stand, there are these little tubes. And each of these tubes represents a flower. And so within each of these tubes, there were silk threads. And so the sucrose would essentially move up these silk threads, and they would accumulate in 2 silk loops at the top of the flower. And so when they accumulate at the top of the flower, the bees would simply come up and take the nectar. They use 5 different morphs, and a morph is just a type of plant. And so basically, we can see here 8-0. 8 represents the total amount of flowers on that plant, and 0 in the parentheses represents the amount of rewarding flowers. That means there were 0 rewarding flowers on that plant. Before they started the experiment, they allowed the bees to train. They trained the bees on 8 4-4 plants. And so they basically did this because they wanted to choose the best bees, the bees that were best at foraging, the bees that were able to collect nectar the best. And after they did this, they took away all the artificial plants, and they put in 32 experimental plants. And they assigned the same amount of plants per morph for all the sections. So basically, if we had a 2-2 plant, there would be the same amount of 2-2 plants in each of the different sections. And they assigned different rotation angles to each of the plants because they wanted the bees to feel like they were in a real environment. In experiment 1, they hypothesized that bees preferred larger-sized plants, meaning more flowers, and bees preferred plants that had larger-sized rewards. And so in this experiment, they assigned 8-2 plants, 8 2-0 plants, 8 plants, and 8 8-0 plants. And they equally assigned each of the different morphs into each of the different sections. So for example, we see this 2-2 plant. That means there were 2 of the 2-2 plants in each of the 4 sections, which add up to 8. In experiment 2, they thought that bees preferred large-sized plants over smaller-sized plants. So they specifically experimented if bees preferred larger-sized plants over smaller-sized plants. So basically, they had 16 2-2 plants and 16 8-2 plants. In experiment 3, they thought that bees preferred larger-sized rewards over smaller-sized rewards. And so basically, they assigned 8 8-2 plants and 8 8-8 plants in each of the different sections. And they also assigned 16 2-0 plants, which served as the control. In experiment 4, they thought that bees learned the locations of rewarding plants. So basically, for example, if a bee came up to a rewarding plant, it would learn, and it would remember where that rewarding plant was, and it would continue to come back later. So in this experiment, they first allowed the bees to forage, and then after a period of time, they collected them. And then they exchanged rewarding plants with non-rewarding plants. And so they thought that bees would still go to the original locations of rewarding plants, even though the rewarding plants weren't there anymore, because they were exchanged with non-rewarding plants. And in experiment 5, the setup was exactly the same as experiment 1. And so they allowed the bees to forage, and then they took in the bees, and then they did something tricky. For each of the 8-8 plants, they took away 6 flowers, thus converting the 8-8 plants to 2-2 plants. And so over here, in the second part of the experiment, we see that there are originally 2-2 control plants. But they hypothesized that bees would continue to go to the 2-2 plants because they were originally full rewarding plants, even though the 2-2 plants had the same amount of reward as the control 2-2 plants. In experiments 1 to 3, they collected 5 data sets for each of the bees. So in experiment 1, there were 6 bees, so that means there was a total of 30 data sets. And in experiments 2 and 3, there was a total of 5 bees, and so therefore there was a total of 25 data sets for experiments 2 and 3. And so in experiment 1, there was a total of 1,997 visits on average. And they're like, hey, the experimenters thought that this was way, way too much data. They didn't want to include all this data. So basically, they discarded a lot of the data. So here we can see after they collected 240 visits, that was phase 1. They discarded. And then again, the next phase was phase 2, and then they discarded it. And so basically, this allowed them to make their data sets much smaller, because they didn't want so much data. And in experiment 4 also consisted of 5 data sets, and it was noted phases 6 through 10. And so in this experiment 4, they first collected 240 visits, and then they didn't discard it. The next 240 visits they didn't discard. The next 240 visits was phase 7. And so they did this because, remember, they exchanged it. They exchanged reporting plans with non-reporting plans, so they didn't want to discard any data. But then after that, the experiment was pretty much held constant. Everything, all the conditions continued to stay the same. And so they started to discard data to make their data sets smaller. In experiment 5, they first allowed the bees to forage a little bit. They didn't right away start collecting data because they wanted the bees to warm up, essentially. And so after the bees warmed up, they were ready to forage. And so they collected 200 visits. They collected 200 visits, the first 200 visits that the bees made. And then they collected the bees, and then they took away 6 flowers from the 8-8 plants, thus converting the 8-8 plants to 2-2 plants. And so, and then after they did this, after they took away the 6 flowers, they started counting immediately, and that's how they collected all of the data for experiment 5. And also, as I know for experiment 5, they counted the number of visits they counted the number of visits to each plant. So essentially, if there was, for example, there was 200 visits before picking. So essentially, they counted, like, for example, there could have been 100 visits to 8-8 plants and 50 visits to 8-0 plants. And they, as one more note, they used ANOVA and GLM, which are complex statistical and mathematical formulas which aided in trend analysis. So basically, these different formulas allow them to make their graphs in the results section.